ever wonder what thrives in the night of our life? Hey there, I'm Danielle Zapchenk, and I'm so thankful you are joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I am thrilled for you to meet my guest, author and creative arts pastor, Sarah Gerbers. She shares about how life can look beautiful even in the darkness of grief.
Probably grieve as long as I live. I'm not going to get over this, but he's come to me in my questions. He's come to me in my accusations. He was there next to me when I was telling him, you're not good because you allowed me to go through this. He never left. Like, my questions did not scare him away.
Here's my conversation with Sarah Gerbers. I am thrilled to introduce you to Sarah Gerbers. Sarah and I are connected from a previous guest, Kayla Cornish. She was on episode 151. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on the Parable Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, you are in my hometown area. I grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin. You're in the De Pere, Green Bay area. How long have you been in that area? I know you're pastoring a church with your husband.
Been here about 13 years. We were youth pastoring first, and then my husband became the lead pastor of our church, Destiny Church, in 2019. And I've been the creative arts pastor there since 2017. So that's our little history in this area.
Okay, creative arts pastor, obviously music. What does that look like for your role specifically?
Yeah, the main part of my role is to lead the worship teams, to train up new musicians, in charge of the Sunday worship teams, and help with the teenagers as well on Wednesdays, and basically anything creative. There's a growing group of poets that I've been leading, and we actually go out into the community and participate in community poetry night and writing groups. And so I have a very, very fun career.
I have never heard that, of having a group of poets.
I was inspired by C.S. Lewis. He had a group called the Inklings, and they met in a local pub and would share their writing. So we're called the Destiny Inklings. And
I love that.
Yeah,
that's so
it's pretty
cool.
neat.
You had mentioned that you had served in youth ministry. Now, sometimes when you're in youth ministry, or I don't know, just day to day, when you encounter someone younger than you, you're like, wow, I'm getting older. Okay. So what is something that maybe frightens you or excites you about getting older?
I still feel like I'm 20 inside, but I'm 42. In fact, I'm going to a concert in June with some friends some of them happen to be quite younger than me. And one of them said that they were thinking about getting there early, but they have some 40-some-year-olds with them, so they don't think we can hang. And I'm like, oh, come on. I still feel so young. But we were youth pastors until, our late 30s. And so the kids used to make fun of us and say, we're going to have to push you guys in wheelchairs pretty soon.
Oh my gosh.
So the challenge is you still feel so young inside, but the truth is you're aging. And
yes,
and we have a teenager now. We have a 16-year-old daughter. So teenagerhood is just so much fun. I never get tired of it. I'll probably be 85 years old and still have some sort of pull in youth ministry somehow.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the spectrum. I also worked in youth ministry for a while, and just when you can remember that when I was 12, 13, 14, and I looked at my grandma, she looked really old to me. And now, my mom is that. She's a grandma. I'm I don't see that. So there is this just giant gap of time where what you imagine, and then when you finally get there, you're like, oh, this isn't really that bad. Right. What concert are you guys going to?
Ben Rector in Minneapolis.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you've ever heard of Ben Rector, but
he's very fun.
Yeah, we're going to go see him in Minneapolis. Super excited.
As an author, you kind of write about things that are also surprising, maybe hidden in plain sight. And so I'd be interested to know, what is something that maybe was hidden in plain sight this week that surprised you or brought you joy?
I walked into a coffee shop the other day and I was going to meet a friend, and like, what are the chances that you'd run into someone out in the wild that you haven't seen for a while? Her name is Audrey. She was the conductor of my daughter's orchestra. So I haven't seen her for a few years because my daughter has been out of orchestra for a little bit. Anyway, she has been battling cancer, and I have been following along on her caring bridge, just reading her insight. And she has been nothing but a warrior and an encourager through this process. And there she is sitting with a friend. And immediately the Lord was like, give her a copy of your book. And so I went outside into my car, grabbed a copy of my book, wrote her a note in it. Just, she's encouraged me so much. I hope this book can be an encouragement. And I walked in and gave it to her, and she gave me probably 10 hugs. And she said this is exactly what she needed in that moment. So just the chance encounters that the Lord sets up are just so beautiful. So I had one of those hidden this week in a coffee shop, and it made my week.
I love that, Sarah. That idea, that practice, was that always something that was instilled in you, or was that something learned over time?
I think it's always been instilled inside of me. I remember being a little girl, and I'd be writing little narratives in my head of the different things that I was noticing in my days. And I felt like maybe I was really weird for doing that. But, as a little child, I remember swinging on the swing set and watching the sunset and the ways that the clouds would move. And I think I've just always been in love with this life.
That's such a good, I've always been in love with this life. I think that that's a challenge for some people to say that they've always been in love with this life. And I don't know if that is just because gratitude isn't a part of their daily life, but I think that's a building practice, and it takes time. It's a muscle reflex almost of recognizing these pieces of the goodness of our life that is already there, because we can get so bombarded with culture, with different things coming at us, that we go into comparison mode or just a real spiral of negativity. You recently decided to get off social media, and I'd love to know what that process was for you, like the reasoning behind it, and just kind of the need to say, okay, I'm good, because you wrote something. I long to fall in love with anonymous living. And I was like, I love, like, there's a desire, like, to be out there, but also to choose to be like, do I want people to see this stuff about my life? So yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, now I'm on a podcast talking about it, anonymous living.
Yeah.
I was getting ready to publish my book, Moonflower, and I was looking for an agent to see if this could be traditionally published. And it was last December, and one agent told me, I would represent you in a moment, but you don't have a large enough platform. You need at least 20,000 followers, proven followers, so that we can see you can generate at least $100,000 on your own. And I thought about it. How do I become a social media influencer? I don't think I want to do that, but they're telling me I should. The next day I was out on a walk, and the Lord told me, tear down your own platform so you can finally build me one. And I knew exactly what he was talking about. I knew he wanted me to get off social media. I've loved social media. I'm a social person. I've flourished on it. I love seeing people's lives and being a part of that, writing them encouraging notes, tried to use it for the good. But I had become addicted, and I knew I was. So the Lord called me away, and the next day I knew, if I don't do this, I'm deliberately disobeying him. So I didn't know, though, if it was just for a season or if it was for forever. So I got off social media, started thinking and praying about what this would look like. And the first month off social media was a little jarring. I had become so accustomed to picking up my phone and scrolling in a moment. And it was a muscle memory thing. The first month I was constantly picking up my phone, getting ready to scroll. So it was kind of like a detox. And then the second month, I just started asking myself, why have I been taking photos of things? Is it to share? Because I'd take out my phone and I'd be taking a picture and like getting ready to share it, but I'm off social media. I'm not going to share it. What is my motivation behind doing what I'm doing? Is it for everybody else or is it for me? Is what I'm doing, does it matter if I don't share it? So I started asking all those questions. And I came to the conclusion that maybe there's more meaning in it if I don't share it. And then I started hearing these sermons about living, like The Power of a Quiet Life by Francis Chan. And then I heard a message by a woman who actually didn't even give her name because she ministers in the Muslim world and she can't be known. And she was talking about the beauty of anonymous living. And something began to stir inside of me. Is life fuller if everyone knows about it, or is it fuller if I'm living in real time right here, right now with the people in front of me? So this last year has just been a dissection of that in my own life. And then when I got to 6 months off social media, I realized that it didn't fit who I was anymore. And the work that the Lord was doing in my life was so deep that if I were to get back on, I'd be right back in the hamster wheel of comparisons, living life with my phone right in front of my face. Being in everybody else's lives, you know, waking up and hearing a million voices before I would seek God's. If I were to get back on social media, I wouldn't be, I don't know how to do it in a healthy way personally. And social media can be so good, but for me personally, I did not know how to do it in a healthy way. So finally here, almost a year later, I knew that the Lord wanted me to put a final goodbye to social media. Nobody else needed it. I just needed it. I needed it for closure because for 2 decades I was on, and it was a big part of my life. And I needed to be like, okay, I love you, everyone, but I have to step away. And I think that's just added to what God is doing in my life and teaching me how to notice and how to be present. And it's been a hard and beautiful process.
Thank you for that honesty, Sarah, because I feel the same so many times where it is super fun, but there is I purposely have timers on my phone and when apps are available and not available, just to remind me, be like, no, you don't need this right now. And also for somebody who utilizes it to promote this podcast, it is weird. You're like what you said, where you were saying, why am I taking this picture? What is the motivation behind it? And usually it's not there, but I can feel myself when I get into seasons of okay, maybe I should try this way. And that is a great question. I mean, really for anything in life, what is my motivation?
Yes.
So
I traveled to Southeast Asia, and I can't even tell you where I went because it must remain anonymous. In April, I traveled there, and I was a part of the underground church and fell in love with the people, but none of them exist on social media. They can't be known because what they are doing is illegal. They can literally be thrown in prison for 10 years because of what they're doing. And then if they're caught a second time, it's life in prison. And what they're doing is rich and so much meaning, and it doesn't lose meaning because they're not on social media. And so that was also really a big, important piece of what I witnessed this year, that God used that to show me it's okay if you're not known. It's okay if you are anonymous and only known to me. So
that's so good.
It's been wonderful.
Well, Sarah, you are going to share about one of your lessons in your life and how God has taught you something through this experience. So I would love to hear your parable story today.
Well, my parable has to do with the moonflower, which is also the title of my book. But I also want to point to the Bible, specifically in Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, and kind of relating those two things together. So my book is called Moonflower. Moonflower is an actual flower that blooms at night. And I came across this title for my book because there was a woman who was on one of those America's Got Talent shows, and she had cancer, and she called herself Nightbird.
Yes.
I don't even think she finished the competition because she passed away. And I thought that was so beautiful. Here she is singing in the night season of her life, and she called herself herself nightbird. And I started asking myself, what else thrives in the night? So I Google searched and immediately came up with the moonflower, started learning about it, and I grew them for myself. And truly, there are so many correlations to life because of the moonflower. Like, they are poisonous, but yet they flourish. Like, they have poison in their bones. They know what poison is, yet they bloom, and they only bloom at night when no one is looking, for just a brief moment. So I grew my own moonflowers, and they look weedy. You know, like for months, it's just this bush of weeds that grows and grows and just takes over. And then like I planted in May, and I had to wait all the way until October, and I would watch, like I'd go out there every night late and shine a flashlight. Are they blooming yet? No. And finally in early October, these like delicate little blooms would open one at a time at night. And if you weren't there to see it, you'd miss it, because in the morning they'd be shriveled up and done. So they're so delicate and they're beautiful, yet hardly anybody really knows about them or sees them, but that doesn't take away from their beauty. So when we're talking about the parable of the wheat and the weeds in Matthew 13, Jesus is telling a parable. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, the weeds also appeared. And the owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did all the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. And the servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? And he said, no, because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles and be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn. And when Jesus was telling the meaning of this parable, you know, he related to like the kingdom of God is like this. And he's talking about how, you know, the good seed is sown, the believers in the world, like sowing seeds into the world. And then the enemy comes along and sows, you know, what is bad, like the people who are against the kingdom of God. And like, it's not up to us who are untrained to try to decipher one from the other, like the good seed from the bad seed, because at the end, it's the angels who are the harvesters who, you know, allow both to grow up and then will separate. Like, it's not up to us men to do it. So the greatest meaning behind it is, you know, like, yes, sow good seed, but we are not the judge. We aren't the ones, because Jesus is talking to people who really knew like their horticulture, right? They were planters, and his audience would know that if you wanted to sabotage another man's field, you could plant this noxious weed that was called bearded darnel, and it would sabotage their field. However, when the weeds are growing up with the wheat before they're mature, you can't tell a difference. So, you know, you couldn't go out there and weed your field because the wheat looked just like it. Yet we can like read this and see what Jesus meant by it, but we can also begin to apply this in our own lives, like the concept of this. A lot of times things happen in our life that seem bad, but are actually good. And there are things in our life that are good, but are actually bad. And until it's all matured, we can't tell a difference. And so in my own life, my husband and I have walked through 5 miscarriages. We had our daughter, Addie, and then after she was a threatened miscarriage. And praise God, she was born healthy and a miracle. But then after her, we lost 5 babies, and it was a very traumatic, sad time in our lives. And this is where Moonflower comes from. It's a book not about how to get over grief, but look how beautiful life is despite grief. So in my life, like, these miscarriages are very painful pieces in my life. And I could easily point to them and say, this is a weed. Like, the Lord is not good. Look what he allowed me to walk through, and pick that out as a weed. So I love embroidery. I love to embroider, and the back of an embroidery is a hot mess. It makes no sense. You don't see the big picture until you turn it around. It's like the kingdom of God for us. We see like these knots of messiness. We see the weeds. We don't see the bigger picture until we get to eternity. So until I'm fully mature, I won't be able to truly tell the difference between the good and the bad in my life. But what I'm starting to see is that these losses that my husband and I endured are not weeds. Our babies are like forever a part of our story. And because of it, I've been able to minister to so many people. What I thought was a weed has turned into something beautiful. And just like our moonflowers, they look like a mess of weeds. But until they come to maturity and start blooming like in the hidden spaces of night, I don't understand the meaning of that whole moonflower bush. So the losses in our life, the hard things might not always be bad. They might not always be weeds. They might actually be the wheat that make us who we are, like give us the character of who we are.
Sarah, I love that you walked us through the conjunction of your book plus the parable, because it ties itself so beautifully. I have no reference for the moonflower. One question on that. You said it blooms and then it shrivels up. So is that bloom only one time?
Yes, each bloom is there one moment and then it's gone.
Oh my gosh. Okay. You talked about like maturing, and whether that is the plant needs to mature, whatever that is, or sometimes it can be for ourselves. I mean, that is really challenging, especially when you're walking through grief, you're walking through a challenging season. How does one navigate that when you're waiting for the thing to mature or you're having to do the work, like that waiting process, just like you had to wait for that plant to grow from May to October. Talk to us, encourage us like about that season.
Well, we don't really know who God is to us as our comforter until we experience him as our comforter. When we think of God, we think that he is light, like no darkness can be around him. But the truth is, when we're going through hard things, he comes into the darkness with us. So when we're going through that hard stuff and we're in the grit of it, he's there with us. He's abiding with us. So it's hard. And it's not like he's there to only remedy our grief. He's there to show us who he is in our grief. And he like takes our hand and walks with us through that. So, I'm still grieving. I'll probably grieve as long as I live. I'm not going to get over this, but he's come to me in my questions. He's come to me in my accusations. He was there next to me when I was telling him, you're not good because you allowed me to go through this. He never left. Like my accusational questions did not scare him away. So to those who are stuck in this grief, it's okay to be there. It's okay to not be okay. But like, look right next to you. There is a God who hasn't left. Even if your situation tells you he's left, even if you can't feel him, even if you can't hear him, he's there in like the thickest darkness and doesn't leave. So that's the most beautiful thing I've found personally about our God is that he's there with us in these imperfect situations that life throws at us. And he leads us through it. And sometimes it's not a bright, sunny sky that he allows us to walk into where everything then makes sense. But he like remakes us in the darkness. And sometimes it looks completely different than you think it would, but it's still beautiful.
You said when you were figuring out the title of your book and your theme, you were wondering, what else thrives in the night? And why is it so hard to decipher what is happening in the nighttime? Because it is really challenging to figure out, like when you were saying, like, is this good or is this bad? To really take the time to recognize, like, hey, this isn't working, or this piece like is really painful, or maybe this piece of wheat doesn't need to belong here. Why do you think that it is so hard to decipher those pieces in our life, especially when we think it's good?
It's hard to see in the darkness. your pupils have to actually like dilate to allow more light in so that you can see the details in the night. I don't know if you've ever been on a walk in a really dark forest at night. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust, but once you accept that, all of a sudden you start seeing these details in the darkness. And our hard situations do that to us. It's hard to see. It's hard to decipher when we're going through hard things. Is God even good here? But it just takes time just to truly see all the details that he has in the darkness for you to discover.
You had mentioned that because of all of the loss, the miscarriages, you were able to see, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the podcast, these pieces that God uses to connect with other people's story of grief or how they're walking currently in their life. What has this writing this book experienced for you? Because I know your husband had told you for a while, like this, you should be writing a book. And you're like, I don't think so.
Right.
And so now, like looking at it on the other side, it is now really truly birthed out into this world. How have you seen these pieces of like, okay, I can see the goodness of God through this, whether it be with other people or just how I have written about it personally?
I think it has helped me to realize just how sacred this life is. Grief doesn't get the final word when it's said and done for the Christ follower. I may die still feeling grief here on earth, but that grief is not going to carry with me through heaven. So each loss I've experienced in life, because this book isn't just about miscarriage, it's about like the different griefs that we had in our lives. My husband started telling me back in 2006, after his sister passed away. She was at the age of 29. She had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. She went from healthy to gone very quickly, and we still don't really understand what happened. I had a dream about heaven, and that's when he started telling me, you're going to write a book. You're going to write a book. I didn't feel like I had enough content to write a book. What am I going to write a book about? But as I kept walking through life and kept facing losses and hardships, as we all will, I started realizing that those things can kill you, can destroy you, can make you bitter, or they can truly make you realize how brief this life is, how miraculous it is that we're even here in the first place. And, for the moonflower seed, before you even plant it, you have to crack it open and soak it in water before it can even be pressed into the ground. So these breaking processes that we have in our life can actually lead to beauty. Like you could be like a seed that sits dormant or bitter with no growth in your wounding, or you can allow the Lord to like plant you and tend to you. You can turn into this beautiful bloom when you didn't even expect you could. So walking through these losses hurt, and it still hurts. And it did make me bitter. But through it all, I realized that with each death that I've experienced in life, I've experienced more of God's goodness, and that he even created me in the first place. Each day is truly a gift.
Yeah. Sarah, as we wrap up, I'd be interested to know, do you have anything that you are looking forward to? It's a brand new year. Any hopes, any dreams for this book, for yourself, what you are interested in growing in personally?
I have prayed that God would give this book legs and wings to reach whoever it is supposed to reach. God is my only platform. I don't have a social platform. Truly, this book is standing only on Him. So I am very curious to see who ends up with this book in their hands. I am very curious who God will bring into my life, who I can minister to. I will be doing a lot of traveling for missions work. And I know that God is not done with His lessons for me. And in addition, I will be starting to write my next book. And I have yet to get true direction on it, but I believe it will be some sort of Moonflower devotion book for those who are currently in night seasons of life.
Oh, well, Sarah Gerbers, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast. If people wanted to connect with you or pick up Moonflower, what's the best way that they can do that?
Moonflower is on Amazon. And also I have a very small, quiet corner of the internet that I write on Substack, the Moonflower Chronicles. So I would love for people to read what I'm writing on a weekly basis.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. All of Sarah's information will be linked today in the show notes. Thank you so much for being a part of the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Wasn't that a beautiful picture of how Sarah painted for us the Moonflower and Matthew 13 together? I can't wait to go Google Moonflower right now after this. If you want to reach out to Sarah or grab her book, Moonflower, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time together with Sarah. Number 1, what is one way you can dive into anonymous living this week? And number 2, ask yourself the question, what else thrives in the night of your own life? And can you find the beauty despite the grief? This episode wouldn't be possible without my editor of a husband, Eric, who does a seamless job of the production of the Parable Podcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you could spend your time doing so many other things, but taking it out a moment and spending it with me and Sarah, I greatly appreciate it. Remember, your parable showcases how God is with you even in the darkness of night. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.